So I wanted to first of all thank you all for coming tonight to hear from our inspirational guest speaker and best-selling author, Paul Loeb. Can everybody hear me all right? Oh, okay, great. So, my name is Deirdre Kamlani, and I'm a board and program committee member of the Greenwich League. And we thought it was fitting that we're hosting Paul on National Voter Registration Day, especially since his focus on citizen engagement aligns so closely with the work of our league. Before I introduce Paul, I want to remind everyone that the League has some important events coming up, starting with our first Selectmen and Selectmen debates on Thursday, October 10th at the Greenwich High School Performing Arts Center. And this will be followed on Wednesday, October 30th by our tax collector and town clerk debates right here in the town hall meeting room. And I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everyone to vote on Election Day, Tuesday, November 5th. Finally, a week after Election Day on November 12th, we're hosting our third annual Harvard Case discussion in partnership with Greenwich High School and the Greenwich Historical Society. We'll be reading and discussing the case titled A Nation Divided, which is the case about secession in 1861. It's a fascinating read, and it has a modern relevance, too. We may even have a special guest professor from Harvard Business School join us, and spaces are limited, so stay tuned for this one and check out our website for more details. And if you are interested, please respond right away when the invitation comes out. So I am very pleased to be able to introduce Paul Loeb tonight, who kindly traveled in from the West Coast to be with us. Paul founded the Campus Election Engagement Project 11 years ago, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit praised by people on both sides of the political aisle. It is on over 400 college campuses around the country, and its work centers around converting America's young voters into active and engaged citizens. By listening closely to issues raised by college students, Paul's organization has played an important part in increasing student voter turnout by 50% between 2014 and 2018. I think we all know that as millennials and younger generations outnumber boomers and older generations at the polls, it will have a transformative impact on our politics. And what most people don't realize is that we're at that pivotal moment right now. Paul is also the best-selling author of 2 books, Soul of a Citizen and The Impossible Will Take a Little While. He has spent decades researching why some people choose lives of civic commitment while others abstain. His books are closing in on nearly 300,000 copies in print, and he has kindly agreed to stay after the event for a book signing. So anyone interested in getting a book can see Dorothy at Diane's Books, who's here with us after the talk ends. And we also want to welcome 2 of Paul's colleagues who are here with us tonight. You may have met them on the way in, Nasheen and Liam. They'll be around after the event if anyone would like more information about their work, and if you would like to sign up to get more information on an ongoing basis from the Campus Election Engagement Project. So please join me in warmly welcoming Paul to Greenwich.
They're very glad to be here, and thank you, Deirdre, because I know how long you've been working on this. And at one point, I think 2 weeks ago, it was like, oh my God, we haven't gotten the RSVPs. And then I said, well, it is just past Labor Day, and a lot of people have been on vacation. So I said, just send out another email blast and let folks know. And they're coming back, they're paying attention to their mail and their calendars. And I think there will be interest, and I'm just, very delighted to see all these folks here. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit and then answer questions about, in some sense, the challenge that we as an organization have taken on, which is how do you get students to vote? And it's interesting because if anyone young votes when they're young, they vote the rest of their life at a higher rate. And this is true corrected for demographics, corrected in every other way. And so in some sense, if you're seating voters now, there's 2 curves. There's the people who don't vote when they're young, and then there's the people who are. And, people are going to switch back and forth, but by and large, that first group is always going to outpace the second. And so, part of what we're doing is taking on a challenge with tremendous impact for the present and tremendous impact for the future. And that's how we frame it. We work with just to give you a little bit of background and before talking about some of the issues of that students face. We work with colleges and universities, with their administrators, with their faculty, with student government, and the goal is to basically get them to use their resources to get students involved. Because if you think of it, you can come in from outside and you've got your clipboards and you're signing people up, but you're kind of catching people on the fly. You're seen accurately as outsiders, except maybe the league, because the league's been around for so long that, and it's, oh, okay, it's the league, so this is great. But it's still not the institutional reach of the school. And so what we're trying to do is to create cultures where the entire school, from every possible facet, essentially works together to get the students to vote. And so we do that. We also then amplify that reach. We give $1,000 stipends to, we call them election engagement fellows. They're students who reach out to their peers, and all the research suggests that peer-to-peer reach is by far the most effective way of getting people to participate. And we had 250 of them last year, and we're hoping to get 350 resources available for 2020. Now, why is it that students don't vote, and young voters in general? A combination of reasons, and they reinforce each other. So one is that they're more transient. They may not necessarily be going to school in the communities that they're from, or they may. They're also often, I would say, and this is regrettably, targeted by laws. There was a appeals court that struck down voting laws in North Carolina and said that they'd targeted African Americans with, quote, surgical precision. Used to have hostages, they were trying to make it hard. And the laws have really targeted young voters as well. So even in Wisconsin, used to have a high rate of voter participation in the coming back because of a single raft of laws. And they said at one point, well, we're allowing student ID, and there wasn't, out of the entire University of Wisconsin, 2-year and 4-year. It was 2010 2-year school that met the standards. And so what that meant is that in a time of massive budget, the school had to spend really to issue compliant IDs, and we spent, I'm going to say, about 4 years struggling and urging them and saying, if your students vote, the legislature is going to take their concerns more seriously. You're probably going to get more money for your budget. So ultimately, it's a good investment versus if they don't vote and they can simply be ignored. But what it meant is that effort in trying to get them to meet those compliant IDs, was effort that could have been spent on other kinds of things. And so to help them navigate the voting laws, we encourage students to volunteer intersecting things that we ask schools to do. We ask them to register the voters. We ask them to help them navigate the voting laws. We encourage students to volunteer and multiply their impact for candidates of their choice. We educate them on candidates and issues, and we help get them out to the polls. And the voting rules aspect, the way I would describe it is it's sort of like you're 18 years old or 19 years old, and here you are, and there's the voting booth, and in between are 4 pits of alligators. And you're looking at them, and you're thinking, they have very large teeth, they look rather hungry, and I don't really care that much about the candidates anyway. I am staying here, I am not going there. So what is our job? Our job is to basically, at least metaphorically, create that path around the alligators to say, it's not that hard, it's actually okay, go and vote. You won't get eaten by the alligators. Because it often is overwhelming, and I would argue that not just argue, all the data shows that if you're coming from a family where your family is voted, or voted for generations, you're much more likely to vote. It's easy, it's like, this is what we do. My mom, they took me to the polls. That was like, we're showing you democracy. But if your family didn't, say they're immigrants, they weren't able to vote. You were born here. It's not necessarily in the tradition, or at least not in the tradition of voting here and navigating those rules. If your family, say, comes from a less professional class background, you're less likely to vote. So there's all sorts of barriers that people come with to begin with of just, what are the rules? How do you do it? And when you start adding new ones, as has been happening, it has the anticipated effect of essentially daunting participation. So that's one area. And, the schools have to, sometimes they do it in very creative ways. So in Wisconsin, this is maybe my favorite video, it's called Joe Goes to Vote. And Joe, I can't remember his last name. He's the chancellor of University of Wisconsin La Crosse. And our student fellow convinced him to do a video where he he plays the bumbling fool, for lack of a better word. And in this video, Joe, the chancellor, is not very bright. And so he gets everything wrong. And he's confused on the day. And he's like, oh, I'm going to go over to the library to vote. And no, actually, Joe, it's the student corrects him. It's the student union. And he whips out, he gets in line. I'm so excited. And I've got my Visa card for ID. No, Joe, your Visa card doesn't work for ID. You need, and then it shows you one of these 8 things, and you also need a letter from yourself, from Joe, confirming that you go to school, because they put a bunch of barriers in there. And, the little slide pops up of, on I think they're the Eagles, My Eagles site. You just download it, and if you show that and it's on your phone, you can, and you have the other ID, you can vote. So it's not an ideal circumstance in my personal view. None of that should have been necessary, but it's a good, humorous way to do it. And when the students see the chancellor of the school willing to, in some sense, publicly humiliate himself, it sort of says, what? He must really care about this. So we're now, it's on my calendar and we're sort of trying to figure out, we wanted to wait till the new administrations, because, they turn over, are in place, this fall, but we're going to start asking chancellors and presidents that are, at all of our schools, like, all right, here's this video, what do you think? Could you do something similar? Because it really matters. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is create a culture of voting. So that's one, those are one set of barriers, and I'd call them the practical and logistical. And some of them are laws, and some of them are just flat out, you don't know the rules, or you don't know the mechanisms. And teaching people that. So, we give people concrete information. There's another set of barriers that I would call the perceptual or psychological barriers. And they're sort of the sense that students say, if you see there's a banner over there, some of you can see it, some of you can't, and it says, your vote matters. And the banner came from students telling me, as I was traveling around, because I made my living lecturing at colleges for years, my vote doesn't matter. It's inconsequential. And besides, they're all corrupt, all the politicians, all the candidates. They're all on the take. They all have spin people. They all have handlers. You can't trust any of them, so I'm staying home. And it's pervasive. And so how do you address that? One of the things we do is our prime mechanisms, we have these, they're over on the table, they're nonpartisan candidate guides, and work really, really carefully. That each one takes about 40 hours a week of work to put in. We've got a team, I've got a 19-year veteran, senior Encyclopedia Britannica editor, former Tokyo bureau chief of the LA Times, former veteran New York Times reporter, some people who have spent their lives saying, how do you convey something accurately and fairly? And they vet each other for bias. And we're going to, our former Republican Secretary of State in Washington is going to look at our presidential guide. I don't know how much time he'll have to look beyond that, but he's agreed to do that, which will be nice. And and basically what they do is they contrast the stance. What is their stand on immigration? What are their stands on guns? What is their stand on abortion? What is their stand on tax policy? Federal aid for education or student debt. It depends on whether it's a federal race or a state race. In some cases it's, I remember in a Virginia race it was, should the Silver Line be extended to Prince George's County, which is the next, it was a really important issue for Virginia. Other states, not so much, because they don't have the Silver Line. So, these are more local, more national, depending on the race. But what they do is to essentially allow students to understand that the candidates really do have different stands. And then they make their minds up, from those different stands. And it came to me, we'd already been creating them for a couple of years. They've gotten more sophisticated. We used to just do yes, no. Now we do quotes with hyperlinks so people can see the source, so it's almost a media literacy. And it's like, no, you don't link to a political blog, right, left, or whatever. You link to a mainstream credible media source, which is reporting what a candidate said. And sometimes candidates say things in a primary that they then sort of erase and brush aside. And it's like, okay, well, that seems worth pointing out. Or they say, how to describe it? It's an Arizona governor who did get reelected. He said, I'm really a fan of higher education. I'm really supportive of it. But it didn't mention that he'd cut all funding to the community colleges in Phoenix and Tucson. They get no state funding. So if a elected official takes a vote or an action as an executive, that probably has primacy over what they said in sort of generalities. And so there's a sort of accountability, but it also is just, really, really rigorously vetted because we're relying on the schools to pass them out. And if they see, a sense of bias, they're just not going to do it. So our credibility is on the line, and it's something we've built up over the years with them. It's these are credible and trustworthy, and we now have a lot of external groups distributing them, from Rock the Vote to MTV's looking at it to there's a group called Do Something. It's kind of a youth engagement online group, has committed nonprofit vote that actually today is the sponsor of National Voter Registration Day. So basically, have said, yeah, this is good, this is credible, we'll distribute it. And I remember a conversation I had, it was back to back. I was speaking at a college in Minnesota, and then I was speaking at a college in Wisconsin. And I was at the college in Minnesota, and they handed me a math class to talk to. And my last math was high school geometry. It had been many, should I just say decades ago. And I got a B in it, I think. It was not my strength. I can handle a spreadsheet, but that's about it. And I didn't know what to say. What do I say to a math class? So I said, did you vote? It's the only thing I could think of. And then I said, can you raise your hands? Minnesota has probably the best voter laws in the country. They're really, it has, as a result, it has the highest voting rates. Or it's always in the top 3 or 4. And half of them didn't vote. And it wasn't the laws. And I said, well, why didn't you vote? It's really pretty easy here. You can register on Election Day. And they said, well, we don't trust the candidates. Everybody's lying. They all have handlers. Everybody's spinning. You just don't know what to believe. And if there just was a list where you could see where they stood, then we would vote. And everybody jumped in. It's like, yeah, if there just was a list. And we didn't happen to work in Minnesota that cycle. So it was kind of a hypothetical. And then the next time in Wisconsin. And I'm at, I think it was a Catholic school of about 4,000 people. And it was a class, and 95% of the class had voted. I think there was one person who hadn't. And I was like, gee, this is great. What's the secret sauce? Can we bottle it? And they said, well, there are these guides. There are these guides, in our mailboxes, and you could see, where they stood, and you could see, the difference between the issues, and we could make up our own minds, and it just made it so easy. And everyone's like, yeah, it was just, it was straightforward. We could see where they stood, so we could figure out where to vote, and who to vote for. And I was battling a cold, so I was sort of spacey, and I thought, oh, well, that's nice. It must be the La Crosse campus it was the local newspaper. They'd done some kind of guides, and the prof says, no, Paul, those were your guides. And, you sent them out to our school through a partner that we work with a lot that does service learning with the school. It's called Campus Compact. And we looked at them and we thought they were really well done and they were really fair. So we just printed 4,000 copies and we put them in everybody's mailbox. And I thought, this is great. So we build on that. The schools send them out on all campus email, on social media. We have a printer who's almost part of the team. He's like, stays up to midnight to get 5,000 inserts from Miami to Gainesville for the University of Florida paper that's agreed to put him in there. And he said, I'd asked him, I said, some of our schools had, this is last cycle, we're getting a little extra money. And I said, some of our schools, they blew them up on foam core. And, that made them very visible. And, what do you think? And he said, well, they would look beautiful when they came off my presses. By the time they reached the school, they would be, if you know what it's like to try and ship foam core, they would be creased and wrinkly and, people would just toss them. However, he said, you've done these banners for Your Vote Matters, and I printed those. And what if we did 2-foot by 3-foot banners, and we put them instead of, we have 2 rules on our guides. One is that they have to be nonpartisan, and the other is that they have to fit back to back on a single sheet of paper. Both rules are very important, and because we don't want to go on too long where the students won't read them. And so instead we put them side by side, and they did things like they put them on stakes, which cost $10-15, and they planted them in front of the student union. And so everybody who's going in and out of the student union sees these guides. And if you know the sort of old adage in marketing that it takes 7 touches, I think it's 7 is the number, maybe it's 5, whatever it is, to get somebody to buy a product. And I think the same thing is true in terms of getting people to vote. Certainly, getting young voters. So you want them to see that guide in the front of you in the student union. You want them to have it come in their inbox or in their social media. One of the things that I loved was I think it was University of Central Michigan, and they had their football team all registered to vote. And so game day comes, 40,000 people in the stadium or whatever it was, big stadium, and the football team holds up their registration cards. And they say, we're registered to vote, you should be too. And then the Jumbotron screen flashes a link to, we'd helped them put together as part of the campus websites, an elections page that tells you, here's how to register, here's what you need, how to do it, all those kinds of things. And they, suddenly you're reaching 40,000 people. And so we thought, okay, a lot of our best ideas almost always come from the schools. And so we just basically thought, okay, let's put together a guide. This is a great lead story. Let's poll our team, because we're working in 20 states. What other experiences have schools had in getting athletic teams to be able to help promote a culture of voting? And people came up with lots of examples, put them together in a guide, and we now pass it out to athletic teams, and try and get them as stakeholders. Last fall, somebody said, have you heard, one of our staffers, what about campus libraries? I mean, everybody uses the library. Aren't there things they can do? I'm saying, yeah, I guess there are things we can do. And so he'd just gotten his master's from Vanderbilt, and I'll go, I know the librarian, I'll talk with her. And we again had people query librarians at campuses we work with, and so we have a resource for what libraries do, and so it's sort of like step by step by step. We were orientation directors. We were very proud to get. We had, for the first time, our fellows used to be only in election years until now, and Amy, our national director, and Courtney, who runs our fellows program, got this idea of piloting off-year fellows. And I was at first, I was like, because I'm the sort of the budget allocator. I was like, but wait a moment, there isn't an election. How can we use fellows when there isn't an election? And they're like, well, what if they worked on things institutionally and tried to get the schools along with our directors, but they would be working from inside as students who were therefore being listened to. And so let's try it. We did a pilot of about 15 fellows, and it's really interesting. One of them got voter registration at orientation, which we've been working on for a long time and have a number of schools have done. They got Temple University in Philly, University of Pittsburgh, Iowa State, the big community college in Montgomery County in Pennsylvania. And they just, they made this stuff happen. One of them at University of Central Florida, Nausheen's alma mater, before she was a White House fellow, which was pretty cool. 70,000 students, comprehensive social media plan. And, instead of saying, students like social media, you should do something, which is sort of, to be honest, and do something about our guides maybe, kind of where we'd had it in previous cycles. They mapped it out step by step. At this point, while registration is going on, we'll do this. At this point, we'll do something else. At this point, leading up to voting day. And it was wonderful, and student government adopted it, and we're going to use that as a template for other schools. They're pushing at Ohio State for Election Day registration. I mean, Election Day holiday, so make it easier to vote. Don't know if that'll happen or not, but, if it does, certainly it's going to increase the turnout. And if you look at the sum total of all of this, what's interesting to me is Deirdre was actually citing some old numbers on turnout increase that were the best we had until last week. And they were based on the overall youth turnout increase, which was indeed stellar, and it was indeed about 50% from 2014 to 2018. And there's about 20 million college students. We work with schools enrolling about 5 million students. So that's a significant piece of that increase. And then last week, there's a national study that tracks campuses itself. It takes about 9 months after an election to actually, total and process it. And student turnout, I'm used to saying youth turnout because those are the numbers we had, between 2014 and 2018, and this is a 1,000-school study, went up 110%. I mean, it's staggering. If any of you have ever worked on campaigns, you're struggling to get the 2%, 3% increase. 110. It was 19% in 2014. It was 40% in 2018, which is staggering. Now, these aren't all, these include some schools and states we don't work, and there's other groups on campus. But, we are the largest, have the largest on-the-campus presence of any group around. And, we think we accounted for, a significant and real slice of it. And we were delighted. I mean, because we knew it was going to go up because schools have reported that. But just to see this confirmation in a tangible way was really profound. And so I guess what I want to do, and I'll open this for questions a few minutes, is just from my perspective, students are a group whose voting is contingent. And there's often a way of, it's often a kind of resignation where people say, oh, this younger generation, they just don't really care. And what I think that does is it fundamentally abdicates responsibility. Because it actually is contingent on what the rest of us do. And at least for those gathered at schools, it's contingent on what the schools do and their peers. But part of what we're trying to do is to mobilize their peers. And so if, in fact, and it's taken some convincing, to be honest, but by now the schools, we have relationships that are really strong with a lot of, these major schools in these states. And they say to us, okay, what do we do? We want to address this facet. They come up with an idea and we roll it out. It was yesterday I discovered, I was actually meeting with a foundation that's going to, I think, give us some money. And she said, do you know about University of Pennsylvania and the flu shots? I said, no, we don't. He said, well, probably helped a little bit by the fact that they've got, a fairly robust health program. So like most schools, they really, really want students to get flu shots because, otherwise one gets sick, the next gets sick, the other gets sick, and, it doesn't guarantee it, but my wife does public health communication for a research institute, and, the gap between having a flu shot and not having a flu shot is pretty significant. So they want everybody, they want that healthy population to have it. So what do? You always, if you get a flu shot, which you should, they hand you a little thing, are you allergic to eggs? It's a sheet of the side effects because some people shouldn't get flu shots. And at the same time, they handed out voter registration information. I thought that was brilliant. And so, I came home from the meeting and I emailed Amy and Courtney, our number one and two, our director and associate director, and I said, hey, do you know that Pennsylvania, and I had a Pennsylvania person, do you know that Penn is doing that? And the Pennsylvania person said, no, I actually didn't know that. Let me ask, my contacts there, how exactly they're organizing it. Because, part of the problem is our staff are stretched quite thin. So they said, I didn't know that. And we're like, you know what? Flu shot season has just begun. Let's roll this out. Let's suggest it. Not everybody is going to be able to do it this cycle, but if we can get it, if we can get as many as possible this cycle, it's one more venue. So I think, it's again, the ideas keep bubbling up. And what I would argue is that, if I look forward in terms of 2020, they're going to face a couple of challenges. They're going to face the laws, which they have to be navigated through. They're also going to face almost certainly all sorts of dark money attempts to try and get them to stay home, to be cynical, to feed that, they're all liars, they're all, thieves, that perspective. It's going to happen because it's already started to happen. And so I think that the most valuable thing one can do in some level is to get them credible information, to give them a sense, to make it a social norm, as in the presidential video. Everything, was doing that. We have a little video called Incredibly Close Elections. It's like it's a minute and 20. We may chop it down to a minute and 10 as attention span shrimp. But it just basically, it gives examples of incredibly close elections, like I don't know if folks followed the control over the Virginia legislature, the House, in 2017 was decided because there was a tied vote in the pivotal district. It was exactly even after multiple recounts, and they drew the names out of a hat, and that controlled the legislature. So we talk about that. We have a little slide on that. There were actually, I'm sure nobody remembers, but there was a U.S. senator decided by, I think it was 2 votes in this state, actually. It was in the early 60s. I didn't even know that before I started researching it. You're just sort of like foraging around. And it's like, wait a minute, a senator decided by 2 votes? Yeah, that could happen. So, we try and we point out that the margin in the presidential races, in I think 8 states was that there were, how to describe it? There were, I think, 35 colleges that had enrollments larger than the presidential margin in their states. Something like that. I can double check the video. But the goal is to make it clear to them that vote of themselves and their peers, that it matters. And I think that's obviously the league, who we work with all over the country, has been pursuing that broad mission, since its inception. For us, we have this sector of, these students who, again, if they vote now, will continue to vote. And so that's our goal. And, if folks want to talk, I'd love to answer questions and talk with folks about, what we do further and, if there's any ways to help us do it. So thanks very much. Yeah. Yes, question. And we'll pass, for those who came late, we'll pass around, if you missed the sign-up sheets coming in and want to be able to be in contact, we'll pass them around. Yeah.
So welcome.
Thank you.
We actually had an election here in which the candidate for first selectman won by 1 vote.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that was 1977.
Wow.
Our young people truly stutter to the wings. They go to colleges all over. They go in the military. They go to Europe. They go to Brooklyn. They go everywhere.
Europe and Brooklyn being the far ends of the earth. Having once lived in Brooklyn, I can attest.
But most of them are still registered here.
Yeah.
And the big challenge is funding.
Right.
Do we try, and I heard you say through peers,
Right.
is that the best strategy?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, they have the choice, at least at the moment, they have the choice of voting at home or at school, and it's up to their discretion. And so we try and convince them primarily to vote at school, because then we essentially are dealing with a standardized set of rules and timetables, and this is the place you vote, as opposed to dealing with 50 states worth of scattered rules and and how to vote. So it's just logistically easier. And that said, there may be I'm sure in that selectman election they might want to whoever lost might have wished that one of those, well, I guess two of those students, Howie. Oh, there's my. And then at the both ways, but that's primarily Howie. Oh, there's my. And then at the same time, in terms of the outreach for peers, we really encourage it because that is who they're going to respond to. I mean, that's one of the reasons we do our fellows, and sometimes people are anchored in communities as well. So we did I don't know if you followed the felon and restoration rights in Florida, where Florida had 1.5 million disenfranchised felons as a legacy of the Jim Crow era laws, and the league was quite active in this initiative to overturn it. And because we have to take, even in some ways, a more neutral stance even than the league does, which can take, you have your procedures for determining an issue stand, although you won't take a candidate stand, we have to be neutral even on issues. So we did a pro-con, because that was what the schools would distribute. And then we talked with them and we said, should we generally translate things into Spanish in states with high Hispanic populations. And we said, to our contact in Miami-Dade, which has 165,000 students, should we translate it into Spanish? And they're, yeah, absolutely, because it's not just this student, it's their brother, it's their grandmother, it's the broader ripple. So I think engaging students as, the word ambassadors came to mind, voting in general is going to have this broader ripples, particularly at two-year colleges. Yeah.
How do you choose the states? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Okay. How did you choose which schools and states to concentrate on?
Right. Well, in a situation, as we've sort of grown and evolved, how to describe it? It's a hard task getting students to vote. So we've primarily targeted the ones with, in some sense, the highest profiles elections, like the presidential states and the Senate states and that kind of thing. And so that's been how we've done it. At the same time, we, for instance, just for the first time hired, I don't even know if she has started yet, but we found, we've hired somebody we call in a large person, because that way, if there's a state, like we don't work in Connecticut, a school in Connecticut approaches us and says, we'd like to work with you. Our previous response has been, we'll put you on an email list. Here are some of our materials. It's a self-guided nature tour, but please do it. And that does work to some extent. I remember there was a conference, and I was in our workshop it was, I think, University of Central Oklahoma was sponsoring, and I thought, boy, this sure sounds a lot like SEEP. And I went up afterward and said, do you know about our organization? And they're like, yeah, that's where we got all our ideas from. So, so we've tried to, in some sense, in a very diffuse way, get it out all over the country. Now we will have a staffer who they're going to have to do mostly webinars and, things where they're talking with a lot of schools at once, but actively work with schools in all the states where we're not, where we don't have an on-the-ground presence. And then in terms of which schools, when we're in a state, we basically, it's sort of, a commonsensical approach, which is we will send our materials to every school in the state, but we'll concentrate on the larger ones because they're the larger ones. And, we reach, so, it's, we most of the time don't have a student fellow at a 1,000-person campus. But if it's a 20,000-person campus or a 15,000 campus, we will do everything we can to have one or two of them.
Hi, thank you for all that you do. We really applaud your efforts.
Oh,
And
thanks.
I just wonder, in this time of extreme partisanship,
Right.
how are you able to convince the schools and students and anyone else that you affect that your materials truly are nonpartisan when a lot of people are making those claims? But
Right.
how are you able to
Yeah.
get that credibility?
It's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that we do is that we are trying, in some sense, to, I don't know, bridge and heal some of those divides. I mean, I'm thinking of our University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee fellow. And Wisconsin, as some of you may know, that race in which Governor Scott Walker narrowly lost was a very, very, very bitter contest and very, very polarized. And so one of the things he did is it wasn't an easy thing to do, but he got the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee campus Democrats and campus Republicans to sit for a joint photo. And he made, I don't know, I can't do this, but he made a balloon donkey and a balloon elephant and, held them both up. And he said when he sent the photo in, he said, it's kind of a small thing. But these days, maybe it's not such a small thing. Maybe it's a pretty valuable thing. That, to at least, and they're sort of awkwardly posing and awkwardly smiling, but it does feel important that they're recognizing each other as human instead of just calling each other names. So, so some of it is the on-the-ground reach and just how we handle it. We are really reaching out to everything. We will try and get the young R's and D's to do joint registration drives because, if they work together to register other students, then the students divide as they divide. But they do that. In terms of the guides, I think it's interesting because when we do annual surveys after each election cycle, and we ask, what resources didn't, what could we do better next time, and we're continually building and improving. And it's all for the resources, always the guides. It's like, we love the guides, we love the guides, we love the guides. And then there's a space on our, on the forum to elaborate. And what they say is they like the fact that they're meticulously sourced. Because, given the incident, I mean, we're trying to put together a resource on real and fake news. And so one of the ones we're going to look at is California University of Pennsylvania's library did a resource. And part of theirs, it was the top, the top 10, I think, news stories in 2016 on social media and how many people saw them. Of the top 10, the 5 highest ones were things that did not happen. Were fake news. The Pope actually didn't endorse Donald Trump, but 1 million people saw and passed on and engaged with the notion that he did. Hillary Clinton, whatever one thinks of her, didn't actually have a secret deal with ISIS. To promote. I mean, just, one makes a judgment, we hope, based on reality, not on, and one can choose one candidate or another. But those 5 things had more viewership than the top 5 legitimate stories of that cycle. And so, because our stuff is meticulously sourced, because if I had, I'm just what you say, we got a certain threshold, you got to meet wholly, be able to be doing a 3-way guide, because our stuff is meticulously sourced. Because if I had, I'm just what you say, we got a certain threshold, you got to meet wholly, be able to be doing a 3-way guide is, it means you have a third less questions. A lot, not even mentioning the work. And so we say, if you hit the threshold, and sometimes they do, then we do a 3-way race. And if you don't, then we don't. But we haven't gotten a single piece of blowback, even though our stuff's been pretty visible. I mean, it was on the front page of Huffington Post, and the political managers would see it, and occasionally somebody would say, "You're correct. Sometimes we'll say no position found on an issue. You're correct that was the position, but we've now since had a position, and here's our position." And we'll say, "Okay, that's your position, but we're not necessarily going to frame it in the way that you frame it, because that's your spin. we're going to frame it in a really neutral way and say this is their stand. So I think, I mean, it's a really interesting question, but I think what happens is that essentially the guides prove their own worth and credibility over time. And again, we work really, really hard, and that's why we've got literally every guide will go through at least 4 or 5 different eyes just to catch that, subtle nuance of tone, I mean, even in language, it's like so-and-so claims that versus said that, just stuff like that.
Over here.
See.
Excuse me. It really is fascinating because you have this, by being politically neutral, it seems to me you have an opportunity to build on that in a wonderful way. When we walk out of a voting booth, all voters are handed a decal that says, "I voted today."
Right, right.
But suppose you stand there on campus and
Right.
students are voting, and as they pass out, you hand them a decal, and you say, "This is admission to a campus party that we're going to have. In 2 hours, they're going to have a potluck supper and plenty
right.
of beer. The only stipulation is you can't put up partisan political posters, and you can move around and schmooze with other people that voted. It isn't necessarily important that you identify your preferences or your party affiliation." Do you think that has any
Well,
potential?
it's interesting because we have a master guide called 7 Key Ways to Engage Your Campus. And in our initial draft of it, we said, hold a party, and you have to have voted to get in. And we sent it over to the National League because we sent it over to the National League, and they said, well, in some states. It's a party. So anyway, the National League said, well, in some states that's illegal. It's considered buying votes. So we have to be a little bit careful. And what we've actually said is, and the same issue with like businesses offering like free pizza or whatever it is, voted. And so what we've just because we've ended up having to navigate the rules is we say, if you have a sticker that says vote, you can get in because you're promoting voting. But you can't be required to vote. So we actually do that, and we do some of that stuff. It's always challenging because of food adds up really quickly. But I do think, and on the other hand, students love pizza and that kind of stuff, and so I think it is something. We've tried to do some of those kinds of things, but we have to be a little bit careful. We have to be careful about doing them. So there and then there.
Question.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you about the future of electronic voting,
Right.
Because it's so clear that the young generation does
Right.
everything on their phone.
Right.
And I have a 22-year-old and a 20-year-old,
Right.
and just trying to get an absentee ballot physically to them and physically returned
Right.
from them to here we only succeeded 1 out of 2 times.
Right. And that's often the case.
Well, because the town clerk said, well, it was mailed, but it was never received. There's no way to track it.
Right.
So, since they do everything on their phone, I don't know. So the first question is, does any state have electronic voting?
No.
Does any country have electronic
No.
voting? Is it even conceivable that we could move in that direction?
So I was in an argument about it a week ago with some young sort of techie-oriented folks. There is a move towards electronic registration, online registration. My state of Washington has that. I think it's about, I don't know, Liam or Noshin may know the answer. I think it's about 1/3 of the states that now have that. And I think to me, it's a logical thing. It's easy, it's accessible, you can confirm it, so you can actually, unlike this ballot that never arrived, you can say, am I registered? Yep, I'm registered. Great. Okay, good. That takes care of it. So I think having online registration makes all the sense in the world. I would argue, and I did like a week ago, that the risks of electronic voting are simply too great. I mean, the hacking in, the vulnerability of machines to be hacked is one thing. You put everything online, and you think that you've fail-safed it. You think that it's, and the argument was like, well, it works for banks. Well, it does, except there was this, I can't remember where it was. It was, it was like $100 million theft from a bank, in the international global routing system, where somebody figured out a way to hack in, I don't know, it was in Cyprus or something. I can't remember even where it was. But, they managed to just vacuum up a huge amount of money. And, I think the banks worked it out and shared the losses. But you do that in an election, and, you've changed the direction of a country. So, to my mind, I mean, the gold standard actually seems to be the simplest, which is you have paper ballots. You can scan them, whatever, but you want a trail, you want the receipt, you want to be able to say, to go to a precinct and recount and say, 763 Republican votes, 696 Democratic votes, and you're going to get the same response. You recount it, and it's tangible. Once the electronic stuff is just, it's too easy, and we've seen too many just problems that from my mind I'm hesitant. And I remember I actually did, one of our supporters is a guy named Vint Cerf, who, if anybody invented the internet, he actually did as a young grad student at UCLA, and then went on to invent email when he's like one of the gods of the tech world. And I was meeting with him, and I asked him about it because, and he said, yeah, I'm kind of wary about it. So anyway, this is my thought on it. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much
my
for
pleasure.
being here, and
Yeah.
thank you for everything that your organization is doing to remedy the problem. And thank you for laying out some of the reasons why we're facing this problem.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if your organization, or if you know of any organizations that are doing things to fight the structural problems that are causing the lack of youth turnout, like the ones that you mentioned, and because it seems to be getting worse.
Yeah.
In the last couple of years,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights
Yeah.
Act in Shelby County versus Holder.
Right.
In New Hampshire, they tried to pass a law that made
Right.
it so that you had to have a driver's license in New Hampshire so that students couldn't
Right.
vote there.
Right.
In Florida this week, Governor DeSantis decided that the online registration system needed to go down for periodic maintenance, which happened to be during National Voter Registration Week.
Oh.
And you mentioned the North Carolina map that was surgically drawn to
Yeah.
reduce the power of African American votes.
Right.
They adopted a new map this month that's
Right.
only marginally better.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you know of any groups that, if we wanted to also be involved in fighting
Yeah.
the problem at its root, that we could get involved with.
Well, I mean, the groups that tackle that, and we sort of deliberately don't, except where a student has a vote on an issue before them. We don't really get into the advocacy side, but I would say something like Brennan Center works on it some, ACLU works on it some, Fair Elections Network does some. I'm just trying to think of. The League works on it, for that matter. I mean, the League does quite a lot of work on that stuff. A good place to start. Those are ones that come to mind immediately. Again, we just, we try our best to not get schools in a situation where a legislator who disagrees with them is going to say, you did this, we're cutting your funding, and then they all run for cover. So, we're more, okay, these are the laws, how do you comply with them, than advocacy around the laws. Although, it's a continual debate, in the way of, this is a law that makes voting harder, should we weigh in on it or not? Or this is a law that makes things better. And sometimes we thought, well, maybe we leave it up to the students, we educate them, on issues. But it's not our prime role is just get them to vote within the landscape that we have, which might then change some of the laws. Let's see.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you ever close the loop with the candidates and let them know that, the number of registered voters at the university has increased this amount, and this would
Right.
be a great place for you to speak. On my way over here, I asked my daughter where I was going, and she said, "Oh, just get the candidate. They want to meet the candidates."
Yeah.
So, do you see a trend in candidates doing a better job of addressing young voters?
Well, I mean,
or
one of the things we
here at
try and
universities?
encourage, we encourage, and we have to we have to be super nonpartisan about it. So we sort of encourage candidate forums, but then they really kind of both have to participate. I mean, you just, like we can't, the school nonpartisan, yeah, I mean, the nonpartisan coalition can't sponsor a forum where one of the candidates comes and the other doesn't. So that's part of the challenge. But I think, what I would say is, in some sense, as youth voting goes up, there is a greater incentive for the candidates to visit the campuses, because instead of saying, well, everybody knows they're not going to vote, so I'm just going to concentrate on the people who are, over 50 and therefore reliable voters and the rest of that kind of stuff. But it is something of a chicken and egg. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's hard. I think we encourage the schools to have candidates visit, but again, they sort of, if we're going to sponsor it, and it's sort of, well, we wouldn't be the sponsor. It would be the campus nonpartisan coalition that we help create and advise. If they're going to sponsor it, they can't say, oh, sorry, the one candidate doesn't want to come. So that's part of the challenge. I mean, I think League hits some of those same issues too when you're trying to put together forums. Yeah.
First of all, congratulations on all the great work you're doing. Has anybody, any of the groups focused on the kids who do not go to college, which greatly really outnumber those who do go to college?
Right. There definitely are groups working on that, and it's really, it's really important. There is their turnout is lower, and they're more disconnected. They're more sometimes susceptible to manipulation because they are more, or even more susceptible, I would say, because they're more disconnected. So I think there are attempts, and some of them would be, I don't know what I'll call them, sectoral based, for lack of or demographic based. So attempts to mobilize non-college African American. A lot of them are localized groups, doing that kind of work. And we'll, if they're really nonpartisan, we'll partner with them, and if they're quasi-partisan, we probably usually won't. We're always making these judgment calls. It's like, let's look at their website. Let's see, they're actually saying nonpartisan, we'll partner with them, and if they're quasi-partisan, we probably usually won't. We're always making these judgment calls. It's like, let's look at their website. Let's see, they're actually saying, and if they, I don't know, have a big picture of Donald Trump with horns coming out of his head, we probably can't aren't going to partner with them, Yeah. Right. Right. And implement changes in the structure that make it easier to vote. So automatic registration means, people have to opt out and choose not to. In some sense, to my mind, there's some real changes in the structure that make it easier to vote. So automatic registration means, people have to opt out and choose not to. In some sense, the push voter registered orientation is, you're signing up for this. Here's the library, here's food service, whatever it is, and you get a chance to, you can opt out and you can not register, but you also get a chance to register. And the more you make it a routine, the more likely it is. The same thing, same-day registration. States with election day registration have higher turnout than ones that don't. Online registration boosts it. Mail-in voting, automatic no excuses mail-in voting boosts it. We have that in Washington State. We've jumped considerably in the rankings of voter turnout because it's just, it's easier. But then you run into issues which we now finally have resolved, of these esoteric rare items called stamps that, for certain generations are just like everybody knows what they are, and for other generations, they have no idea what they are. So, you got to have them posted, you have to get it to be postage paid. So I think there's a bunch of, rules, early voting where you extend it. The idea that, if you're working 2 jobs, you really can't vote, because you can't get time, if you're, in certain occupations, professional class, you can usually get time off. But if you're you're working at between 2 7-Elevens or something, you're not going to be able to. Yeah.
What about sending all of your information to large schools where the vast majority of kids don't go to college? Part of their senior year.
Yeah, I mean, how to describe it? It is a good idea. Whenever high schools have inquired, we sort of say, I mean, they're all publicly available on our website. You know, it really is a question of capacity, to be honest. You know, it's sort of like, you know, we've got this, we are the leanest of lean organizations, you know, and so everyone is just stretched and doing 12 things, and each time we add something else, you know, it's like, I'm always the person who adds something else, and then my poor staff is saying, no, we're stretched, please. So I think the challenge there is, you know, perhaps through partners and stuff like that. I mean, we're trying to, you know, we have a project to get our guides out beyond the campus gates. So Rock the Boat used our guides last time. I think I mentioned Nonprofit Boat, Youth Service America. They have a lot of, you know, because they're Youth Service America, you know, high school and K-12 partners. So I think it's probably going to be, if it happens, it's going to be happening through partners. Great. Maybe take one more question, if there are any, and then I'd love to talk informally. Okay, last question.
So what structure do you leave behind on the campuses of the work that you've done in, I don't know, central Oklahoma?
Yeah.
Who will be there for the classes that follow, the transient student population?
Right. Well, so it's a really good question. So and Oklahoma would not maybe, better example would be Central Florida or Miami-Dade or Ohio State. And so basically the students are transient, but the school's administrators and faculty, well, there's a little transient, but they're much more ongoing. And so one of the things that's really valuable is that our work does build cycle by cycle. And so we did originally, we just sort of went away for 4 years and we realized that didn't work, and then we went away for 2 years, and now we don't go away. We keep working with the schools. And so, because what we realize is it takes so much work, you're pushing the ball up the hill, and then you just go away and let it roll down. You know, it doesn't, you know. So now we're basically constantly trying to get the schools to keep planning, because the other thing that happens is you've got a plate of different things you're going to do. And we get election stuff as part of that plate, of an overloaded plate. And then you go away and something else fills the space and you have to bump something else a year later. So by getting the schools to continue with different initiatives, even when the non-election years, what you do is you kind of build a group of people who are used to continually working on elections, and that makes a huge difference. You know, so it's a real multiplier effect there as well. So many thanks. We would love to, you know, I'll be over at the book table. I'd be very happy to sign books. Nosheen and Liam, Nosheen's our special project director, Liam is our North Carolina director, to talk about just the work that we do. If any of you are interested in, you know, helping support that work, it'll allow us to do more things and go further with them. And many thanks for coming. You know, and if you didn't sign the sign-up sheet but would like to, like if you came in late, please do.
Hey, how's it going? Good. Yeah, of course.